welcome to our third ever episode, and today I'm really excited to be joined by Katerina from Scenario Architects. Scenario are based in London, and I think it's fair to say probably best known for beautiful contemporary residential architecture. I think it's stunning. And
you got one fan at least.
Just the one
I'll
over
take
here. So Katerina is a project director. You work across multiple projects with private clients. So I'm really interested to find out, and I know it's something that we've talked about before quite a lot, how you work with designers to really marry that form and function.
So, in an ideal project, but very often we've talked about this before, interior designers are not brought on early enough in the process. But when they are, sort of the dream from the start. I guess it's almost like a Venn diagram. We have our part, the interior designers have their part, but actually there's quite a bit that overlaps. And I think the challenge is how you work together on the parts that overlap.
Yeah.
And the best collaborations are we establish right from the beginning who's doing what, who's sort of carrying the responsibility, particularly for the areas where
really
we overlap.
Yeah.
Who is, yes, we overlap, but who owns that part? So I'd say the most important thing is establishing that right from the start. And once you've got that, you've got a framework in which you work with. Respect, I think each sort of professional respecting what the other does and understanding that is their specialty and it's not.
And also, I think probably pulling strengths from each other.
Exactly.
So, as a designer, there are definitely things that I would come to the architect for, even if it's just understanding how some of the design intent is going to work in a practical sense. So, I think it's really pooling those areas of expertise.
Absolutely, and vice versa. And coming to you and saying. But also, I find that where it helps so much to have an interior designer. We architects sort of. I think interior designers have an even more personal relationship with the client. We don't take the clients, we might take them to one kitchen showroom, for the kitchen, which is a really big part of the design, but the rest of the time, we have sort of quite structured meetings. I find interior designers, I don't know if that's your experience, you have a personal relationship with the client. You go with them, you go shopping with them.
But also you get to understand their life in a different sense. So as a designer, we'll understand to the level of detail what sort of bed they sleep on. Yeah. So we know, it's all that detail around how they live, which as an architect you don't necessarily need to have that.
We sort of, hence our name Scenario, we're all about understanding the scenarios of their life and how they want to interact with the spaces in between them and their routines and all that, but we don't go into that sort of depth, what bed do they sleep on, what fabrics do they love. And I find that with great interior designers, because they build that rapport with the client, they then become my point. I almost go to the interior designer because they know the client so well to kind of understand certain elements.
Easier.
Yeah, it does, absolutely.
That rather presumes that you've got a good interior designer.
Yes, absolutely. That's why I'm saysaying I'm talking about the ideal scenario, sort of when it's worked really well, that's how it's worked. The interior designer has built they see each other a lot, especially during construction. During construction, we have, we go to site every 2 weeks. We have a really good relationship with our clients. But sort of we're not going to be seeing, sometimes our interior designers will see the clients 2-3 times a week, especially in the FF&E sort of stage where you're trying to get that signed off.
Definitely.
Katerina, there's obviously lots of constraints on the site, and a client will no doubt come to you with lots of things that they want from their project. But as a designer starting with architecture, where do you start in terms of formulating a design for a property? So
we always say we start with, we call it a blank slate. And again, talking about projects, most of our projects are sort of full refurbishments and extensions, so quite, a gut job. So we start with a blank slate, no walls, nothing. And we really try to understand their ideal scenario. So how do you dream of living in this home? We interview them and we find out sort of how they live their lives. And then from that, we develop the brief, and then we start to map it all out to really understand how the spaces sort of interact between them. But as the design progresses, quite early on, we have to bring in the constraints of planning and budget.
That seamlessly brings you to the big important question for all of us, actually, is how you, and I think it's probably something we all struggle with, how you find the happy balance between budget and what the client wants.
Yeah.
There's usually a bit of disparity, I find.
Usually I'd say always. I think, it's taken a few years for us to, it's probably the most challenging part of the project, especially the last couple of 2-3 years, sort of post-COVID. But I think it's about managing expectations. I think right from the start, it's a bit, when you're buying a property, you say, I've got £2 million and I want 6 bedrooms and a garage and this and this. But at some point, you either be presented with something that has all of that but costs 3 million, or something that costs 2 and has a bit less. So it's all about managing that and then understanding what are the priorities, and then from that extrapolating enough to give them a really beautiful design that they're happy with, but which doesn't blow the budgets. It's a constant balancing act, and we bring QSs in to help us with the balancing act.
But presumably QSs, I work with quite a few QSs, and they do get things wrong. And architects do get things wrong.
Like all of us.
For example, you might put in the wrong, or not calculate the right beam required for a bridge.
Yeah.
How do you sort that out? Do you go to the interior design and say, sorry, this room's going to have to be a bit smaller, or do you actually go back to the drawing board and redo that? How do you remedy a problem that's just found at quite a late date?
So generally, and this is not to toot our own horn, we don't get that a lot because we use BIM, Building Information Modeling, so we have a very accurate 3D model. So when we have discrepancies on site, they tend to be no more than sort of 150 millimeters, or 200 at most for very large areas. So we've never really had something that's happened where we've had to go to the interior designers, that's going to change your design completely. It's usually quite minor, and it's because we so heavily plan early on to try and avoid that.
And I think that's key, it's the planning early on. I've had situations, it does happen quite often, particularly with a refurbishment, where sometimes you don't know until you've uncovered something on site, right?
Yeah.
You can't be certain of these things. And it might be as little as 100 mil, but that can make a difference for example, in a bathroom, if you've got cabinetry or a mirror, but it's about having that team, and with the contractor actually, that's really, really important, so that you can discuss it early enough that you can make changes and you can adapt to those things that you uncover.
Actually, now that you mention it, we did recently have sort of a roof build-up that ended up being more than we had planned in order to insulate it better, but it affected the joinery. And it was a bit smaller, and actually the interior designer on the job just jumped right on and sat down with the client, redesigned it all. So, like you said, teamwork, and we made it, and then we got the contractor to make some changes, and as a team, we ended up delivering. It's a bit stressful when it happens, but if you work together.
Yeah. But I'm a member. Don't judge me by this, but I'm on Facebook. There's a group.
What are you going to say?
It could be anything. Couldn't it? But there's on Facebook. There's a group called Dull Men's Club, and it's quite fun. And it talks
Surely
about.
Not,
it,
Jason.
Yeah.
Not you.
No, the things are notoriously not dull, but it's quite fun. But on there was a guy who had 2 Stanley tape measures. Stanley, a good brand, tape measure, and they were hard. They were the metal ones. And they showed them side by side, and there was probably half an inch difference in the measurements.
That's a worry.
Between the actual tape measures.
Yeah, on the tape measures. So the inch on the first one was there, and the inch on the second one was there. So very man measurements, of course.
Yeah, of course.
But
it goes to show that how easy it is.
So on the construction site, if they're using these things, I'm guessing they're now using lasers more often, but are the lasers calibrated properly?
Yeah.
And
but
that
still,
must be a problem.
there's a there's always a tolerance in construction. That's why we sometimes tell our clients it's not jewelry design. There will be some tolerance. So as long as you work together to find a solution, you usually overcome it. Of course, if it's half a meter out, then
I think that's always the solution to any problem, which is working together, isn't it?
Working together.
And do you, I'm imagining in most of the projects that you do, and whether that's sort of more urban homes or where you've got smaller spaces, maybe, and maybe more challenging even in terms of the outside space and working, how involved do you get with garden designers and sort of putting together the architecture and the garden?
So garden design is another one, like interior design, where you want the garden designer to be on board right from the start, because the part that we take care of, we always say it's the hard landscaping that abuts the house, especially because we normally have level thresholds and you want it all to interact beautifully. But beyond that, we don't do anything. So we really need to work with with a landscape designer, even in really small urban plots, where actually the garden's really small. It's almost more important if the outside space is important. So the way we interact with our garden designers is that it's again the Venn diagram. We have our part, they have our part, but the hard landscaping that sort of is around the house is the part that we overlap, and there we sort of, again, work together, mutually respect.
Certainly for the small projects where there's a small plot next to the house, my experience is that they need the most thought in terms of how they all fit together. Something which I experience a lot is, both on mainstream media in terms of like grand designs or on social media in terms of the huge amount of sort of property imagery that's out there. You often see absolutely amazing houses which have cost millions of pounds to be, custom built by a construction firm and designed by an architect. And then what's in front of them is effectively a patio and then maybe a token pot and then lawn. And of course that makes me sad inside.
Of course it makes me sad.
Both from a design perspective and also from a business perspective too.
Sentimental.
I'm very sentimental kind of person. And I suppose then you're at that sort of coal face with that at the beginning of a project, trying to take the client through all that, and you have your own constraints and priorities as well. How do we bridge that gap to the prospective clients in terms of like, you do know that this is actually nearly as important as the house to get right?
I think it's introducing the idea of bringing in a landscape designer really early on, especially because often our clients say to us, the outside's really important and I want indoor-outdoor living. So it kind of introduces the subject already from the start. And then introducing them. So what we often do is, when you have an architect, you've been working with them for a while through the design process. They trust you. Any consultant you bring in, they'll sort of trust. So it's bringing someone in saying, look, we've got a couple of great landscape designers. Here they are, meet them. And then you sort of meet them early on. And then you sell it because you'll design something and they'll buy into it. Suddenly it's not just, it's going to cost you 100,000 or 200,000 to do a garden and you know what you're getting. You have this beautiful design and then they buy into it. And then the design is a whole, and it stops being the garden and the house. It's the design of the house, and that way it doesn't get phased out or value engineered out, which is often the challenge, I think, with interior design as well.
Value engineering is a phrase that I love.
My favourite term.
It appears in every project to some extent.
Do you find that it often sort of affects?
Yeah, I think that there are very few projects where clients have an endless budget. I have never had a client that doesn't have a budget, whether it's small, big, or somewhere in between. So there's always a level of value engineering, but it comes down to, I think, and whether it's the garden, the interior, the construction, the architecture, it's about prioritising what's the most important. So going back to the point that you made earlier, what are their priorities? What are they willing to compromise on, and what are they not? So there's always that.
Yeah, that's tough.
This question sort of links in also maybe Jason's area of expertise, but I think, especially if maybe got a new plot, a new build, and you're designing something from scratch, then it's really interesting to understand, like, what's that property going to be worth, and therefore is the architectural design fee and then the construction fee going to basically at least equal that at the end of it? And so, Jason, how, and maybe to you, Katerina, as well, how do you get that balance right if you're sort of starting with a blank slate to make sure that your project's going to effectively pay for itself in terms of the value of the property at the end? Was that a really hard thing to get right?
I actually think this is one of our biggest challenges, because often the budget comes from that calculation, right? I bought it for this much, I can sell it for this much, what's left over? And often whatever that amount left over is not enough to cover everything that they want. So we often say, look, if this is an investment and you want a return in a couple of years, then we understand. But if this is a forever home, we often say you're going to have to blow that budget. I don't know how, if people ask you for advice on that.
I think from my side of the fence, if I'm buying a plot, essentially my area here would be to buy the plot and then to hand them over to you as the architect and to you as the interior designer, or perhaps a better one. So I would buy the plot or get an interest in the plot. I would then approach you and say, right, what can we get planning for on this plot? So I'd want to know the maximum square footage that we were going to get away with. I'd want to know the acreage that we could, if the house is going to be X, what acreage have we got left for garden? I want to know from you what planning restrictions are. Are we in an SSSI or an A and a B or anything else like that might affect the value? And then once you've given me that information, I can then work out, okay, with the maximum you can build on there, with this, where the location of, I can work out what the end value can be. And so before my client signs on the dotted line, and as per the next podcast, we might even talk to a financial advisor as well, just to see what room there is in there, and then we will look to you as to how much do you need to spend to get it to this. And is there any margin left? And if there isn't the margin left, then the answer from my point of view is an emphatic no, don't do it.
Yeah, of course.
That said, exactly as you just said, if someone's buying it to live in it for 5 years, 10 years, I mean, the average move time, I think in the country is around about 12 years. In London, for a flat, it's about 3, and I think for a house, it's about 6 or 7. Those numbers are old, but I suspect they're not that different from when I used to work in London. So if you're looking at it being your home rather than your turnaround investment, does it really matter?
Yeah.
Because in actual fact, like anything, if you go cheap, you pay twice. It actually costs you twice as much.
So what's it worth to you?
Yeah.
Also, do you find, I don't know if this is something that you can even quantify or you take into account, but we find in our experience that really, really beautifully designed homes break the ceiling. Is that something it's very different to have an architecturally designed house. It's going to sell very differently to one that, is that something you can account for or do account for?
Yeah, it is. Again, a lot of that's in the eye of the beholder. So a lot of people, no, very few people, but some people will prefer a 1960s Lego style house versus the Georgian manor. They're not my people.
I will not talk to them. They're not worth my time.
But there are...
We're going to switch off a percentage of our audience here already, that we're not interested in you.
The 1960s crew.
I think it's so small they're not watching. But the point being made that that people like different things. So there are people who will pay far more for contemporary than they will for tradition. You get mock Tudor, mock Georgian, mock Victorian, and they all have their place. But here's... They do. They do have their place.
Mock anything, I'm not sure.
They do have their place. Here's my thought, right? Here's my thought on values of property, and I'm talking within London now, really, okay? If you buy a beautiful Georgian house or a beautiful Victorian house in London, there's a limited supply of those. We're not building any more Georgian houses or Victorian houses. We're building modern, contemporary, Art Deco style buildings all around. So when the contemporary, which is only contemporary for as long as it's contemporary, give it a year, it's no longer contemporary, it's now just a modern building. It's no longer contemporary, it's just modern. Yeah. So when it falls from contemporary to modern to, which is what happens unless you keep it going, you're still left with you're left with something which value has fallen through the floor. Yes, it's increased by house prices, but it hasn't increased exponentially along with the side of the Georgian and the Victorian, which, because there are only a limited number of them, and you can't build more, those ones will keep going up, and the more limited they become, as they start to fall down over the next 100, 200, 400 years, they will fall down. So their value goes up and up and up and up, whereas the contemporary house, whether that be in London or in the country, actually it's only value for as long as it's contemporary.
But you say that, but Georgian was contemporary at some point.
It was,
so in a way, the contemporary, if well designed, look at these classic 1960s.
It's a revered contemporary, though. So I think that's if it becomes a revered thing, it's not that different from if you take a car you buy a car, it's worth X. You take it out of the showroom, it's worth X minus, I don't know, some car enthusiasts will tell me I'm wrong, but let's say 20, 30%. But some cars become classics.
Yes, exactly.
And they go up in value again.
So that's what I mean. That's what I mean by well designed. I mean well designed in that it will become. There's so many badly designed contemporary sort of houses, and we just call them contemporary because they were built now. But when I'm talking about contemporary design, I mean truly beautiful, well thought out design, which will last in its own right. Yeah. And then you'll have that amalgamation of the Georgian with a beautiful contemporary, and that will be unique in itself.
Do you find that technology influences that. So, for example, you can put Alexas in a home.
Yeah.
In 20 years' time, 30 years' time, the chances are those Alexas will be defunct and there'll be something else in. So therefore, by default, you've put in a system. We can talk about Cat 3, Cat 4, Cat 5, Cat 6 wiring, or do we even need wiring anymore?
So I agree with you that actually I get a lot of the houses we design, our clients want full home automation, and I'm always a little bit nervous, especially the ones where, you press a button to shut the blinds. I just think go analog, with some smart features, but don't wire in a full crazy system, because I just think maybe in 5 years they'll be defunct and you'll have to pull all those wires out. And so I'm with you on that.
I think clients are moving away a little bit actually now.
Hopefully.
Less clients.
I'm conscious
are
that
wanting...
at some point we're going to be doing a podcast with some home automation company. so
But then you can discuss it with them. I'm sure they have thoughts about it.
You don't want your blinds getting hacked and opened up in an awkward moment.
What's an awkward moment?
I'm no comment. Katerina, you were talking a minute ago about design. Jason talked about how some cars become a classic, and I saw your sort of eyes light up when we then said, well, how that applies to how some architecture becomes sort of classic.
Yeah.
What, as an architect, what for you is classic or, I suppose, timeless design?
That's a really, really good question.
I always ask the best.
So I think
no pressure.
Function, something that combines function and beauty. Something that's just beautiful to look at and doesn't deliver on function will eventually sort of not be used. I think the things that have endured are the things that had function in them, and simplicity. For me personally, simplicity, sort of simple design. I'm trying to think sort of mid-century. If you ask me what's sort of classic enduring design, it's sort of mid-century design.
And is that where you go to for inspiration?
We actually, as a practice, we're sort of a little bit more contemporary and more clean lines. Our aesthetic is we're going to give you a very clean palette, and then you sort of fill it in. But when I'm thinking of sort of furniture and going into a bit more detail, I think mid-century is what stands out for me personally. And I think it was that. It was function and simplicity.
Mid-19th century?
20th century. 20th century, like 1950s, 1960s. Those architects who had the great privilege of being able to design sort of right down to the knife and fork that you are going to eat with.
So you're one of these people that prefers the 60s architecture that we were just talking about then?
But not the one that you mentioned.
Bad.
Not bad 60s architecture. But if you look at now, the furniture, it's sort of back.
Yeah. It is, and I think what also you achieve that really timeless appeal is that eclectic mix, which I personally really love as well, where you get some mid-century pieces, maybe some antique pieces, so you really bring it together. It's about balance in the end, I think.
Same question to you, Ben. Which is your favourite period of house? Which, for you, for interior designing?
So I'm going to push back and say I don't have one favourite, because I love working on really good contemporary design. Which I've done a couple over the last couple of years, which have been beautiful, and they're just really lovely sort of backdrops to put the interior design into. But I also love working on period properties. There's something really lovely about working with the original architecture of a building, and then sometimes being able to add in some more contemporary elements. So what I really love is being able to mix the two together. And often where you've got a period property that you're putting a very contemporary extension on. There was a project that I worked on a couple of years ago that was a beautiful arts and crafts house with a very, very clean extension on the back that was just essentially a glass box. And that juxtaposition, I just think if it's done well, it works beautifully. Yeah. But it's
hard to get it. You want to respect the house that you're in,
exactly.
But you're not trying to copy it. I think I have, and that's why I said before, near Georgia, near Victoria, and I have a very personal issue with that as an architect, because I just think that was for that period. We don't live in those times anymore. We live very differently now. But when you're renovating an existing beautiful Georgian house, respecting that, but then also bringing in the contemporary and marrying the two is probably the biggest challenge.
You complement it rather than trying to.
You can I'm with you on that
Yeah,
design,
yeah,
by the way. But you can merge the best aspects of each one. So for example, I always find with Victorian houses, certainly again in London, not the country Victorian houses, but in London, you tend to have that dark corridor down the back part, a wide front, and then it goes into a narrow corridor and then wide again, where it's been extended to the side. And you can get houses which have got that sort of Victorian fascia or facade, but inside they've been almost fully extended, but they're not Victorian, and they look the part, but they've got all the right bits.
Inside, you mean internally, so that's more the outside.
Yeah, and so I don't consider those faux. I consider those actually a nod to the past.
A modern take to the past.
Yeah.
A modern take of the past.
Yeah.
I know we could talk for hours and hours about all of these topics, and maybe we're going to have to organise another episode where we bring you back again to talk about the merits of faux.
Is there just a couple of quick fire questions here for you because it's fun. Are there any designs that you just are there anything that you absolutely push back on? If a client says, I want this, and you go, I can't work with that.
No, we'd like to, but ultimately the client is going to live there and pay for it. But we would probably struggle very much if someone came to us and say, I want a traditional looking sort of, for the sake of it, I want a traditional looking house for the sake of it. If it's because it's going into a neighborhood that's in a conservation area, and like you said, the front has to be a certain. But I don't think we really push back on anything, because ultimately the client is the boss. They're going to live there, they're going to pay for it. So it's tough as an architect because you kind of have to let go of your own. I'm sure it's the same for you.
They've got to grow up in the real world. So they grow up so
easy to
fast.
design something that you like, isn't it?
Yeah. I mean, I often tell our architects, I'm really sorry. I know you don't, when they're designing something, I know you don't like it, but tough luck, because you're not going to live in it.
Yeah.
Do you have a quick fire question?
Absolutely. I've always gone. Katerina, if you had one sentence to give a piece of advice to a person out there considering taking on an architect, what would it be?
So someone who's thinking of
using an architect as a client or as a consumer.
Do your research, make sure they're actually an architect.
That is such a good bit of advice.
If all architects were a type of animal, which animal would they be and why?
A deer just popped into my head because they're...
Startled by the headlights?
or is that because every time you build something, everyone goes, oh dear?
All very valid points. I was thinking more because they're quite elegant.
I think antelope gives the more sort of elegant antelope. If you could work for a famous person as a sort of dream client, who would it be?
Barack Obama.
And if you could have your dream project tomorrow, magic wand, what would it be?
A new build in an area of outstanding. Not limitless budget. It's
Barack Obama as a client.
Yeah.
Barack Obama with his gorgeous voice just saying, I'd like one of these and one of these.
That's it. And with a good budget.
Katerina, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
And Beck, thank you for organising.
Thank you, Beck. Thank
Superstar.
you for